Welcome back. You're watching NewsX. I am Rishabh Gulati. Ladies and gentlemen, the good thing about modern day is that in these live telecasts, there is a living memory, even though we are stormed with so much information at one given time. But the living memory is one for the records. So mark my words. In these coming decades, the future of the free world will have to be path found by an American president and an Indian prime minister. As we sit, 80 years ago, an Atlantic Charter was signed between a British prime minister and an American president on board a ship as World War II drew to a close. The future century has to be shaped by these two countries. Now, I'm not sure we are fully cognizant of it yet. I am absolutely sure much of America isn't cognizant of that fact yet, but it is upon us. As we speak, the data will come out in a few weeks or a few months. India will have overtaken Germany to be the fourth largest economy. That just leaves Japan and China. A lot needs to get sorted out, and let us not even underestimate that even this whirlwind visit that the Indian Prime Minister is doing in Washington right now is not going to be a stepping stone in that finality of wherever we go. Well, it is. Now, it always tends to be us here in television studios looking for great impacts and major deliverables. Let's open up those conversations on what is possible and what is not possible amongst a lot of hoopla, because the present moment seems to be everybody wants to discuss tariffs. Now, here's a fact check. In the India-US trade relationship, which is worth about $130–140 billion a year, India profits $50 billion. So that's a trade deficit for the Americans. Compare that to the trade deficit America has with China, which is nearer to $300 billion. India runs a trade deficit to China of $100 billion. So global trade is going to be a conversation. You've heard a lot about reciprocal tariffs. Well, I'm told that in this conversation between Prime Minister Modi and the US President Donald Trump, which is about to take place, India is going to be cutting some of those tariffs. In the run-up to the meeting, the US President has been talking about imposing reciprocal tariffs and pointing out that India has some of the largest tariffs, especially in things like automobiles, where we charge 25% duties. In some cases, for fully assembled automobiles, that can even range to 100% depending on port of origin. Let me open up this conversation to have a larger perspective on all sides. On the broadcast with me, sitting in Washington, is Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor. He's with us. Adit Kataria from the Indic Society is joining us. Raymond Victory, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce, is with us. Jordan Cope is with us. Rick Russo joining us on the broadcast as well, and General Jeet Dwivedi on the broadcast. Let me pick this up with Mr. Vickery. Mr. Vickery, since the topic of the moment is tariff. Now, are we in a process of negotiating, and this is how Donald Trump plays it out, or do you really expect a serious tariff war with countries like India?
Well, thanks very much for having me. And I would say at the outset, I agree wholeheartedly that these two great democracies must cooperate to preserve democracies within their own countries and to cooperate to build peace and prosperity throughout the world, or else there's very little hope that any of the major issues will be solved. When it comes to tariffs, it is plain that President Trump is a business person coming from the real estate development area. In that regard, he's already shown in regard to Canada and Mexico that he will take a negotiating position which is extreme and then come down from that to get to where he thinks that he can say, I've had a victory for himself and for the United States. This is a style of dealing with other countries which we haven't experienced for a while, at least not since before the Great Depression. It remains to be seen whether it can be contained. The problem is miscalculation just in terms of a nuclear war. You can have the same thing when people are making all kinds of threats about tariffs, even though they're only intended for them to be leverage. Under the present circumstances, I think the most likely immediate outcome is really no immediate outcome. India has already taken steps to placate President Trump by announcing lowering of tariffs in several areas. It's placated him on immigration by saying we'll take back illegal immigrants. And today, President Trump said, well, nothing is really going to happen until April the 2nd, after I get a report from my people April 1st. Well, there's a lot of time between now and then. I do think that India and the U.S. are going to have to move forward on the trade front, the tariff front. Last time in Trump 1.0, there was almost reached an agreement which would have been some sort of framework for lowering tariffs and having something resembling, although not exactly, a free trade agreement. I think that there'll be some sort of announcement about those negotiations today, along with announcements on Harley Davidson motorcycles, almonds, pecans, and so forth, and then the can will be kicked down the road to see where it really comes out.
Okay, all right. You mentioned Harley Davidson, and this is been a particular point for Donald Trump. He's mentioned it when he was president for the first time as well. He's mentioned it again. So for sure, we are expecting that in a press conference, one of the takeaways is going to be tariffs that deal with the vehicular class in which Harley Davidson exports to India. That's going to happen for sure. We're going to talk about something on nuclear energy for sure, maybe modular reactors. India is already mulling this long pending civil nuclear liability clause that's been an issue since about the time that I began journalism. So it's been a few decades since we've been discussing them, since the historic, of course, deal which happened under Bush and Manmohan Singh. So that's a conversation there. Technology transfer, India placing defense orders, probably for sure. And that's going to be what Donald Trump says, that all right, I've delivered so many jobs because these many billions of dollars of orders Modi is giving me. So let me rope in Ambassador Kapoor for a different perspective. Now, Ambassador Kapoor, let me just jog our memory back, not too far back. Okay, let's go 6 months ago. Earlier, the issues were that, all right, the biggest issue seems to be that the Indian consulates in the US are being attacked by Khalistanis, that there are almost people who are threatening the integrity of the Indian state are moving around, one would say complicitly. There is a massive conversation with Canada going on, which seems it's happening with American support. There is a particular individual on the loose by the name of George Soros. A lawsuit, in fact, charge sheet has been filed against a major Indian conglomerate for alleged bribery allegations in India. So there were a series of issues, all right, and now there are different series of issues. We're talking about migration, immigrant, planes coming back, handcuffs, we are talking about trade. How do you compare the two sets, sir?
Well, I think that, the relations between the two countries are far more significant in terms of the substantive issues, in terms of the substantial progress which is being made. These are not the hardcore central issues for relations between the two countries. Now, people coming back who are illegal immigrants in America, well, they have to come back, they have to be sent back. There is no two views on that. But about the K issue, the Khalistan issue, I think there will be a change of track. Because what I see with the current administration is that they are taking a lot of the issues which are very central to the existence and future of America very seriously. The Breaking America forces, which were getting a lot of, free sort of sway in many areas, like the wokes, having a lot of say in the policies. like the Islamic jihadis, like the Khalistani terrorists roaming around freely in the US, like, so many other aspects of daily life, like the universities being disrupted. So all those areas are slowly being brought back into some sort of rational functioning. And even in the issue of Khalistani terrorists, now I expect some significant progress to be made, in the sense that both the countries will look at each other's concerns a little more seriously, because the breaking US forces are overlapping quite a lot with the breaking India forces. Now, for the two countries to focus on science and technology, on defense areas, on space areas, on so many other positive areas where we have had a lot of discussions on military, exercises, on the threats which are facing both the big threats which are facing us, which are facing the world, like the jihadi terrorism, like Chinese aggressive stance in so many parts of the world. So, to get the focus back onto those big areas is very, very
Okay.
important. I think this visit will achieve that refocus of both the countries, and a discussion in real earnest between our two countries, and
Yeah. So
then move
yeah.
forward.
Yeah, so with all due respect, Ambassador Kapoor, yeah, we can't assume that relations between countries that should seem obvious don't go sour. The India-Canada relationship is a very vivid example of how things go really, really badly. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have ambassadors in each other's countries, believe it or not. And that's been the case for several months. It's a serious issue. So, General Dwivedi, let me put the same question to you before I rope in Mr. Calamel and Jordan and Adit. So, the issues we were discussing, and I sit with you, on a regular basis, it was about how is it that Pannu is roaming around? How is it that Indian consulate staff are being attacked in North America with impunity? It seemed, with support. It seemed that there was a deep state, willing to hold a knife on India's neck. We saw the George Soros has been a major point of conversation in local politics here in India, and he got a US Presidential Medal of Freedom. You know what happened in the New York court against the Adanis, and we all know that wasn't a target at the Adanis, that was a target to Modi. And George Soros has been publicly clear on this. So the issues were there, but they were different. There are new issues now. What do you make of the comparison?
Well, Vishu, first and foremost, I like to put in perspective that India and US relations are strategic in nature, because they are just not bilateral. They have an impact on how the globe is shaping, and therefore I think they are deep rooted. Second point is we need to look at the strategic convergence between India and America. There are no major differences as far as how we see the globe and how we see the regions. In fact, India has a very great role as far as America is concerned in Indo-Pacific, and that's a real area which America is looking at to shape the new order. And secondly, China factor, we both are on the same page. Only thing that we share border with China, whereas America only shares water borders, if at all, on the Western Pacific. Now, coming to these issues which you raised, I think were not the critical issues. Yes, they were irritants, but if you look at American policies, whether it is Democrat or Republican, there is a bipartisan approach to India. Yes, these issues are there, but I am sure that once now they'll get ironed out and realigned, because as Mr. Trump has just taken over, and it is within 30 days our Prime Minister is having conversation or deep conversation with President Trump, I think these issues gradually will get sidelined, and the real issues that we are looking at between the partnership of two democracies, of the two countries which have a significant, I would say, influence on the global polity, these will get realigned. And my last word is that defense is very important factor amongst the relationship between two countries. And defense.
Yes. So I'm going to come and pick that thought with you specifically, but let me get Adit in on this. So Adit, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of history is very long, but it bends towards justice. So the arc of history of Indian strategic relations, as I began by saying, that this century, whether the Indians realize it or the Americans realize it or not, is going to be shaped by the Indians and Americans. All right. This is where the world stands. But let us not assume that the arc of history hasn't got jittered a bit in the past few months. For 5 years, India and China had a border standoff going on that was readily resolved. India has, in the recent past, sort of ramped up its commitment with BRICS. That's a major sore point for the Americans on multiple fronts. Things that should have seemed obvious, that China is the problem, suddenly we had to make peace with the Chinese because we couldn't understand why the Americans were hosting the Khalistanis on their soil. So things were a bit off. I can tell you probably the worst I've seen in several years. Are those things now done, right? Do we come up with the more practical issues?
I think towards the latter half of the Biden administration, India had its arms completely open to them, whereas the Biden administration completely took them for granted, and I would go to the extent to say that they abused that relationship by all of the all of the fallacies that they played with, whether it be the Adani, whether it be the Khalistani elements sitting in the United States, and they used them against India just like clickbait. So I think from that perspective, that trust deficit is not there with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is basically, you get what you get what you see, kind of a thing. There is no sort of political correctness. He's not playing any sort of charades. Which is why the US-India relations, even now, when you see them developing, India's gone ahead with a much more open arms. They've readily said that, we are willing to consider tariff negotiations on, number of domains, whether it be agriculture, whether it be electronics, whether it be even surgical equipment, etc., and including Harley Davidson and Tesla as well, as I'm led to believe. So, from that perspective, I think the trade tariffs, MAGA, the sort of electorate of Donald Trump will get exactly what he has promised to them. The tariff reciprocal relationships will continue to happen, and as a consequence, what Donald Trump will also get from India, what he will be able to extract out of India, being one of the BRICS country where he has a lot of problems with the sort of BRICS economy. And he's called India sort of a abuser of trade in the past. Mm-hmm. He will be able to supply weapons. He will be able to get sort of cut out trade deals on the weapons side of things, on the defense side of things.
Okay.
So he will be able to go back to his electorate and say that this is what we've promised, and we are creating more American jobs as a consequence of that.
For people watching the broadcast, in reasonable living memory, when George Bush was US President and Manmohan Singh was the Indian Prime Minister, something called the Civil Nuclear Agreement was signed, and it was considered historic. It didn't achieve anything. So there's no reactor that's been built in India in these nearly 20 years. But what it did signify that a US President went out of his way to speak to the IAEA, use his leverage, use the United States leverage to remove long-standing sanctions on India. And concordantly, an Indian Prime Minister almost saw his government collapse under his feet because it was a government put together by Communist Party support. It was that much of a risk here in India. So for my American guests and people watching in America, let me update you on what's happened in the past week, 10 days. A US military aircraft has landed in India carrying just over 100 illegal immigrants deported back to India and in difficult circumstances with handcuffs and whatnot. The Indian side, under a lot of pressure from the opposition, has not gone kicking and screaming and complaining about America's tactics. We have said it's their laws, and if people have broken their laws, we have to go by what their procedures are, including the military aircraft and including the handcuffs. This is in India's parliament. So a very pragmatic position has been taken even in domestic circumstances here in India. So let me get Jordan on that thought. So Jordan, this is the context of what we are having a conversation in. I want to situate this immediate conversation because the larger world issues, because Trump might be heading to Saudi Arabia on Ukraine. Who knows what's happening when he says the US has to play a role in Gaza. I'm going to come to those questions closer and dearer to you in just a second. But in the situation that we are in, where the first move of the Trump administration has been send back the illegal immigrants, if there is pragmatism coming from the other side, do you think that's going to be respected?
I think it will, and I think there will be some tough conversations to be had between Modi and Trump, but I also think there's tremendous potential. I think when it comes to matters of undocumented and illegal immigration, there are approximately 725,000 Indians of undocumented nature in the United States. And respecting one's borders is ultimately respecting diplomacy for each other's countries. And Donald Trump has prioritized very much so dealing with the problem of illegal immigration in the United States. 10.5 million illegal immigrants were added to the ultimate tally under Joe Biden's presidency. And so I think the United States and India both ultimately realize, though, the importance of one another. The U.S. especially recognizes the importance of India. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that India and Modi is actually the fourth foreign leader to be invited to D.C. under Trump's presidency, which has ultimately emphasized the importance of dealing with the China threat, which in part and parcel, I believe, is why Modi is being invited so upfrontly to Washington, D.C. And important to note that of all of the four foreign leaders to visit D.C. so far, two of them have been Middle East partners, and one of them has been Japan. And so Trump right now, especially with how he dealt with the standoff with Panama, which ultimately resulted in Panama removing itself from China's One Belt and One Road initiative, has ultimately paved a way for an understanding of dealing with the threat that is China abroad. And the United States ultimately realizes that. I think the U.S. will also discuss some other tough matters, like we've mentioned before, such as the tariff situation in India, which some U.S. government officials have condemned, but which India has ultimately been very accommodating on behalf ever since. And on top of that, just strengthening the economies between both, trying to encourage India to invest more in American energy. And as Adit mentioned earlier, perhaps getting America to ultimately open a Tesla factory in India, but not just a Tesla factory, perhaps also installing Starlink there. So there's so much opportunity and potential between the two countries.
Okay, so let me contextualize the 2 points that Jordan has made. Tesla, why isn't Elon Musk already in India? Well, the first reason it got stuck was because he wanted to bring in the cars that were being made in Shanghai into India, all right? So he wasn't setting up a gigafactory in India, he wanted to pull in the cars from Shanghai. That's where it first got stuck. In more recent times, and you can speculate this, it's gotten stuck over Starlink, because there might be Indian players who want to offer similar services, and they think that Elon will come in and sweep the market. So it's gotten stuck again. He was supposed to travel to India a few months ago. He deferred his visit. He is met with PM Modi with his family just a short while ago. So let's see if some movement happens on that front. Remember, he is now a part of the Trump administration, leading an important wing of the Trump administration, that is DOGE. Let me get Ariel Calamel into this conversation. Mr. Calamel, let me address the immediacy of what we are discussing first, before I take on the broader context of very serious global issues. For Donald Trump, it seems to be the immediate issues were electoral promises. I'm going to crack down on immigration, and I'm going to sort out tariffs, right? This is where we are, and there are other issues, of course, parallel. Now, when it comes to immigration, we've had the plane loads exiting, and India has received one of them without complaint, rather with reasoned, pragmatic understanding that if there are illegal people breaking the law in a different country, well, then so be it. The laws of those countries apply. On tariffs, we are coming back with pragmatism and saying, all right, we are willing to sort them out and work with you. Are those two things enough to get past the immediate situation so that we can start discussing China and Ukraine and the Middle East?
I honestly hope they would be. And your lead into the entire segment really underscores my belief as well, is that it's you look at the BRICS nations with the exception of India, you put Russia, China, and those nations in there. You see this, the globe is developing and the world is developing along two different axes. And China, India and the United States need to work together in a collaborative manner that's going to improve the economies of both countries. That'll be mutually beneficial for both of them, and also pull away. And at the same time, it will hurt China. It will hurt the other countries, because if we look at it, India's in a really bad neighborhood. But India has a very, they have unbelievable potential. They have a very strong economy. The base is there. Unfortunately, years ago, the decision was made to send a lot of manufacturing and strengthen ties with China instead of the world's largest democracy. We need to be working with China along multiple fronts. We need to get over these hurdles, and the way that India has accepted in the immigration, the people that broke immigration laws, has been completely different than you see from the reaction of other countries. And when I hear Trump use the words tariffs vis-a-vis other countries, it's more to address other issues that he's not happy with, and issues, it's soft power that is being thrown out there, and it doesn't just involve trade, it involves a multitude of issues.
Okay.
With India, I think it's more specific, and then once we get past certain hurdles, and Raymond did a great job of outlining some of those things, that this relationship has to move forward. Has to look back at the IMEC, the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor, to decouple from the One Belt, One Road initiative that China's working on to strangle the economies of the world. So I think we need to foster that relationship as quickly as possible. And I think it's
Okay.
important for the democracy and the world.
Okay, so watch this space, because in a week from now we'll be hosting the who's who involved in the IMEC corridor, and we'll having that live conversation very, very shortly. But let me invite Rick Russo into this conversation. Rick, just to contextualize where the conversation was sitting when you joined, we had issues 6 months ago, and a lot of irritating issues, because a few months ago we were told that India's democracy, well, it's whatever we are a half a democracy in some democratic index that comes out from America. I was told that me as a journalist sitting in India, that our journalism standards are worse than Afghanistan from another index that comes out of America. There was a Khalistani issue, and you know what's happened with our relationship with Canada over that. It's not pleasant right now. There was an issue of a court case that had been filed in New York. Things weren't looking pretty. So issues are different now. It's migration, it's tariffs. But how have you seen how India has handled that flight of migrants that landed here a week ago?
Well, first, I mean, things were never as bad as it sometimes seemed in Delhi when you grab one of these negative reports and you think that's the majority perspective, right? At the same time all these things were coming out, India joined Combined Maritime Force Bahrain. We're talking about Indian ports being able to be U.S. Navy docking at Indian ports. We resolved a number of WTO disputes, and on the backs of the Biden administration announcing programs on domestic manufacturing and solar and chips, the White House was absolutely pushing American companies in those sectors to make those investments into India. So, let's not overthink how bad things were. We got a ledger. There's some dark side on the ledger and a lot of positive even during that period. It was a pretty good 4 years. I do think, the plane load, you got a difference, as I think you're kind of hinting at. The administration in India understands, the desire to have people that are here illegally going back. But the visuals of people in shackles coming out of a plane, I do hope today, when they've got quiet time at the White House, that, that Prime Minister Modi can press President Trump to make sure that when this happens, it's done in a more humane manner. And at the same time, get more clarity from the U.S. administration. Where are they going to go on technology and skilled worker visas as well? Because there's a big debate in the Trump camp. People close to President Trump realize these skills are important for the American economy, but the base, they don't really agree with immigration of any stripe and from any nation there. So
so Rick, hold your thought. I want to pick your mind. So here in India, unpleasant. The shackles are unpleasant, but our external affairs minister stood up in parliament and said, if it's US law and US law mandates it, so be it. And that's respectful, at least, of the position. We've not gone kicking and screaming. Despite a lot of opposition pressure here, you can well imagine what's happened. So yes, a chartered flight would have been better. But our position seems to be pragmatic, that if another flight were to come, we would accept it as pretty much inevitable. On tariffs, we seem to be striking a positive note. We are expecting some movement in announcements that are going to happen very, very shortly. There will be some opening up of tariffs from the Indian side. So are we striking the right chord in this first renewed meeting?
Yeah, the Modi camp has been engaging the Trump team pretty actively before the election, after the election, during the inauguration. They know where the United States head is at. And of course, India's exports to the United States are double that of the next largest country. So India has to work hard to make sure that the United States doesn't try to rupture the trade relations as they exist. And so I think taking steps that, won't hurt the Indian economy to any meaningful way, but will open up the door for American exports and appease the things that President Trump has in mind. I think there's a narrow space for India to accommodate, achieve some wins, and at least keep the relationship on trade in an even keel. The bigger question, that hangs out right now, the White House administration officials have privately said that we may actually begin a process that Ray Vickery has written about and worked on many times over the years. Are we going to begin talking about something bigger, a trade agreement of some type, covering sectors or something wider? So I can't wait to see what all they pack in the joint statement.
Yeah,
today,
it's a difficult one. So we have a trade agreement which is now in the bag with the Aussies. It's stuck with the British, badly stuck, to the best of my information. So can it be done? So let me get Mr. Vickery back in. Mr. Vickery, on a pragmatic front, if in this meeting we can sort of have a pragmatic understanding on the illegal migrants being sent back, can make some headway on the tariffs, can we then move on to a larger arc of history, which is inevitable despite what goes up and goes down?
Well, I think you have to look at what you're designating as the larger arc of history. There seems to be implicit in what you're saying that these are two really different and separate things. You have economic issues and then you have political issues. The fact is that they are intimately connected. And India and the U.S. have to be able to move forward on both at the same time. But coming to the political issues, I think that it's not right just to say that the values part of the relationship is not that important, that the real importance is only can we protect our borders and free movement against the Chinese, for example. The fact is that democracies work together and have long-term relationships if they have similar kinds of values, and if they protect those values of democracy, rule of law, being able to see that human rights are important. Those are not just make-weight kinds of considerations in international relations, in my view. And I think that these are important. So I think that, yes, we can be more practical in terms of what happens on the commercial and economic side, the immigration side. And I would say on the immigration side, the real issue is not the 100 people who get off a plane who appear to be not being treated right. It's the 700,000 or so Indians and Indian Americans who are in the United States that have visa situations which are not entirely clear. They may have been students who were here who want to get a job and do it. They may be people who were H-1B and something's happened there. And to say that you're just going to treat all those people the same and get rid of them all, put them on planes and send them back, will be a major impediment in relationship.
Yes.
So the reality is you can't just look at this as a transaction here or a transaction there. A holistic approach has to be taken, and thank goodness there's enough goodwill on both sides, Republican and Democrat over here, and I think similarly on
Yes, fundamentally correct. That's as fundamentally correct as a position you hear in all reasonableness. There is immense goodwill, for the better part of 2 decades. For if anybody is watching this conversation abroad, this is not a death to America country. This is a country that aspires to the same kind of American values, which is why you see so many Indians going to the US and being very, very successful through just sheer hard labor. There are going to be issues, there always will be. There are issues in any relationships, there are issues in family relationships, let alone complex geopolitical ones. So we accept those issues as they exist. It is inevitable that these two countries have to work together, whether we all realize it right now or not. I think most of us sort of now do. So now let me move a step forward with Ambassador Kapoor. Ambassador Kapoor, on the assumption that we are genuinely going in with an open conscience and an open mind, that all right, that Donald Trump has some immediate practical requirements. Migration, tariffs are some of one of them, and we want to go into them with an open mind, right? Our engagement is going to be a bit different than how Trudeau is responding or how the Europeans are responding. We're going to be far more open and not give him what he wants, but we'll negotiate hard, but we'll be reasonable, we'll be pragmatic. If we can do that, what's next?
Well, Rishabh, let me put it the other way around. When, two leaders of two very important countries meet, and I've had to deal with a lot of such meetings in the past when I was ambassador or secretary. What happens is not what is going wrong between the two countries if both the countries have a very positive relationship. The meetings start off with the positive aspects, with the important issues which are of great concern to both the countries. It only ends up with very small amount of time spent on discussions about the issues like illegal immigration, because those are issues which are to be handled by the Secretary here of Homeland Security and by the Home Minister separately, or by the External Affairs Minister in any other format of +2 ministerial visits, or by the Ambassador of India along with his counterparts in the other departments here. So it's not going to occupy any major time. The issues of tariff will be handled by the US Treasury, for example, or the other USTR trade representative. So those are issues which will be just mentioned in passing. There would have been a lot of discussion which would have already taken place on those issues at all the other levels. What will happen between Trump and Modi is what is their worldview, what is their view of the future of India and US relations to challenge the big ticket items, to challenge the bigger threats. So that is where the more important time and more important focus will be on during this meeting. So expect some good headlines.
Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. General Dwivedi, let's pick up where we left off. Okay, 4 years ago, the same US president, situation in the world was different. The US, remember, was still in Afghanistan. There was no war in the Ukraine. The focus was, we had a very serious border standoff that had just sort of culminated. We had a huge issue going on in Taiwan. We were, let's face it, at the end of the Trump presidency, figuring out a massive virus pandemic, which even today, we don't know how it started, even though we suspect it began in a lab in Wuhan. So the world was a little bit different. Now there's a same two individuals are sitting down. How do they absorb the slightly different scenario that we are 4-5 years later?
Well, Rishabh, when two countries which have the ability to influence the global politics and also influence the shapes and contours of new world order, I quite agree with the ambassador that they look at the issues from a larger perspective. They look at the issues from the prism of a geostrategic prism, which is more global in nature, rather than look at the issues which may be peripheral. The point is that when we look at the larger issues, the issues are still sacrosanct because our threat perceptions are quite converging. Our strategic perceptions are almost the same. Yes, the world has changed, but the overall, if you see, the China is what it is where the Wuhan was there, not there, and I was defense attaché in China for quite some time. and also put on the diplomatic hat. The issues which the leaders of the global stature address are rather strategic in nature, and the issues which are like the immigrants, like the tariffs, of course, tariff is a major issue for President Trump, they come as footnotes. So therefore, I think the major issues will be addressed as to how the two countries look at the globe, where are the areas of larger convergences, how the Indo-Pacific is going to be shaped, how the IMEC is going to come up. I think these are the issues which will take major amount of time. Yes, other issues
Okay,
will be
after probably the first time ever, I'm going to humbly disagree with that perception, because I promise you in the press conference that is coming up, it will be about how many billions the Indians are investing in America, how many American jobs that's going to create, what we gave up on tariffs, whether Harley Davidsons become cheaper in India or not, and how many more migrants we are willing to happily take back. That will be a large part of the conversation. Of course, like I keep on referring, there is an arc of history which is bigger than all of us, is bigger than the moment, which is propelling us to a shared destiny. It is inevitable. We are all buyers into the fact, even though some people may be more reticent in the given. So let me ask you a different question, General Dwivedi. On the very practical defense front, where India's primary defense supplier still remains Russia, we want and are already procuring US arms. We have the howitzers, we have the choppers coming. I know we have the UAVs coming. Jet engines, aircraft haven't happened yet. Do you expect a breakthrough?
Well, firstly, I'd like to clarify that when I was discussing geostrategy, I was not putting the geoeconomics on back burner. Well, they'll be going side by side. Now, coming to the defense, over the last about 10 years, there have been a distinct shift in India's purchasing its defense equipment and reducing its dependency from Russia. Because about 10 years back, 70% of the equipment was coming from Russia. Today, that has come down to 40%. And if you see the economics part of the defense procurement, for last 15 years, we have procured $20 billion of equipment from America. And that doesn't come only buyer-seller relation. There have been a lot of movement forward in cooperating, co-manufacturing, and also shifting certain production lines. So I will quite categorically say that there will be definitely much more movement forward in the defense equipment, especially we are looking at big ticket purchases, the fighter jets, because right now in Bangalore, both F-35 and Su-57 were on display right in the air. I think we are going to make some decisions. We have to purchase some more equipment like the aircrafts, C-17, C-130, howitzers are there, striker vehicles are there. All these things are very much, I think, on the inventory.
Okay.
And,
so
of these things will fructify.
Yeah, so for sure expect a big ticket announcement here. I don't think this meeting's opportunity will be wasted without having a big ticket announcement. And oftentimes in bilateral meetings, we in the press keep fishing for big ticket announcements, because what do we make headlines out of, right? In real sense, you can sometimes smell the moment. This is one of them. There's going to be something big coming out of this. It won't be a damn squib saying, oh, we met and we shared coffee and we shared our worldviews and we all left. There's going to be something coming out of this. Before I get Adit back in, let me get Rick into this conversation. Rick, there are pathfinders, and so a pathfinder is required in resetting whatever this India-US relationship is under the Trump presidency. Something is going to happen for sure in the next few minutes, which will be important enough, or at least a takeaway for both sides. If we achieve that, then can we move on to figure out what's happening in Ukraine? What do we do with Gaza? What do we do with climate change and whatnot?
That certainly is a big question. I think overall, the United States and India still have different approaches on a lot of global issues. The one that we have a lot more complementarity is the agreement that China is the major strategic threat that we face across the Indo-Pacific. So climate change, no. India, I think, is a lot more kind of behind the science behind that than I think the U.S. administration is going to be. So that's going to be tricky. I don't think that President Trump is going to look for India's guidance on Gaza as well as Russia, Ukraine. They're going to kind of move at their own pace. China still remains the big strategic factor that I think you're going to see a lot of complementarity. They're talking about, amending and signing.
Okay, Rick, sorry to interrupt you. Just taking in live shots from the White House. That is the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister for the meeting with US President Donald J. Trump. That meeting will continue for just over 60 minutes, maybe longer, after which we are expecting a press briefing by both the President and the Prime Minister. You get to see live shots on your screens as this meeting begins. There have been meetings that have already happened. PM Modi has met with Tulsi Gabbard. He's met with Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. But this is, of course, the main one. It's not only the formal one. This is where the hard tickets get put. A lot of preparation, I can tell you, has already gone into this. As PM Modi enters the White House, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last. He's going to be there again, perhaps for a longer visit. This is an important one because it is sort of getting, I would say, I won't use the word formalities, but practicalities out of the way on what is the Trump agenda. And I promise you, for anybody watching this abroad, the Indian side is going with a very pragmatic approach. We are not going with the approach that we want to push back or be difficult. If the demand is reasonable, we are more than willing to accommodate it. But we will have our own demands. Rick, sorry I interrupted you. Finish your thought.
I was just saying that I think you're going to see less convergence on a lot of big global issues with Trump and Modi than what you saw, I think, with President Biden. But the two big ones, China I was talking about, and the other one you referenced before is IMEC. I think those are the two global issues we're going to see a lot of complementarity and see the two leaders really kind of leaning in. But on climate and other things, either we're going to be on different paces or working independently, I think.
Okay, so Rick, let me pick your mind, because what we've heard so far, right, it seems that, we've heard about Greenland and Panama, and let's pull out of the WHO, which sort of puts UN in crisis, and, probably cut back on funding in Ukraine, which I'm assuming is now inevitable, which sort of puts whether the Brits or the French and the others will be able to step up and, replace the same, which sort of puts NATO in crisis. We haven't heard much about Taiwan and the Straits and Japan and the Indo-Pacific.
Well, Japan has already been, I think, relatively well featured in the administration. And the first foreign policy engagement the Trump administration had was the Quad meeting, ministers meeting that took place the day after inauguration. So, I suspect, they didn't say it quite this clearly, but as they start to draw down engagement with Europe, the last time President Trump was in office, just like President Obama, just like President Biden, we recognize that the biggest threats the United States and India are going to face in the future come from the Indo-Pacific. So while they haven't maybe announced the other side, when you start talking about drawing down our relative military presence and heft in Europe, you got to believe that Indo-Pacific is going to be the place that they double down, because that was on President Trump's agenda last time around. May not have been stated quite so clearly yet, but when you see the Quad, when you see India, when you see Japan featured in early engagements, that seems to be the direction we're moving in.
Okay, so to put context to what Rick was referring to, when India's External Affairs Minister was at the inaugural, sitting front and center, the next day they had a Quad meeting of the External Affairs Ministers, or the ones to be appointed. So let me get Adit back in. Adit, I just want to take a leap back into history for a second to put context to our conversation. So we are looking at the last tariff war between the US and China under Donald Trump in his first presidency. There was supposed to be a meeting to be held when a last round of negotiations, so the deal-making meeting, was scheduled for the January of 2020. That meeting never happened. We all know why, because by the time that January ended in 2020, we knew that there was a pandemic which was coming our way from China. So here we are a few years later, a lot of water has sailed under the bridge. Have we reset it from that moment, or are we picking up from there?
No, I think we're certainly picking up from there. I mean, the bonhomie between the two leaders, we've seen it ever since, both were in power, including Narendra Modi going all the way to Texas, and then, in that famous rally, basically saying, "Ab ki baar, Trump ki sarkar." So we know that they both share a very pragmatic and a very friendly, very cordial relationship, and they will pick up from exactly where they left it off. The one thing that I see different with Trump 2.0 is the expeditation of various issues. I mean, the fact that the moment he assumed power, you look at the way he sort of distinctly came out differently to sign all the executive orders, the sheer expedition of the irregular aliens from America back to their home countries. That goes to demonstrate that Trump has an agenda, and he's willing to go a mile to fulfill that agenda. Just picking up from one of the arguments that Rick actually made, that the inner circle of Trump, which is the Vivek Ramaswamy, the Elon Musks of the world, who understand the importance of the tier 1 or the H-1B visas, whereas the bottom layer of the Trump support do not. Today's rally was very, very outspoken from that perspective. Trump made he drew a parallel of how JSW invested $500 million in the dying steel industry in the United States, and as a consequence, increased the level of job creation as a consequence. So he understands the importance of the Indian intellect, the Indian skills,
yes,
and thereby he is actually reaching out to his core voter, the MAGA vote base, and saying that the Indians are different to the other irregular aliens that we have in the United States.
Yes,
which is why we are going to be accommodating
practicality
them.
on that, and for sure you're going to hear that statement. Like I said, you can easily mark my words. This is easily predictable that there are going to be conversations in the press meeting about Indian companies investing in the US. Indian companies, I can tell you, want to invest in the US. Right? It's not something that they're being forced to for strategic reasons. The US is a huge market. We potentially, from our investments in the US, can contribute to the US market and do what Americans would want everyone to do, is provide goods and services which do well in a liberal free market and turn a profit. Fair enough, that's how it's supposed to work. There is a trade imbalance of $50 billion. It's reasonable for the Americans to ask, listen, hang on. But it's reasonable for them to remember that the trade imbalance with the Chinese is $300 billion. So within reasonableness, we can find this. Okay, I just want to touch upon a few things before I lose the guests, because we're out of time. Jordan, let me come back to now the other bigger, what for sure is an elephant in every room that is discussing strategy and geopolitics, which is what now happens in Ukraine, what now happens in Gaza.
These are big questions to ask right now. I think in terms of Europe, Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, has made clear that European security is no longer a primary interest of ours to which we will be investing as much as we previously had. So that definitely leaves, I guess, a vacuum and a void as to how the Europeans will respond, surely and hopefully by subsidizing their own defense and subsidizing NATO to the degree which they previously pledged and have largely failed over the years to reach that threshold. It seems that Ukraine is willing to ultimately compromise on its borders for land swaps with Russia, and it seems that this has ultimately opened perhaps a pathway to a pragmatic and realistic solution regarding winding down the Ukraine and Russian conflict, at least for now. The big question for now is to what happens with Gaza is ultimately a bit of a mystery, and it's one where we need to read between the lines in terms of how Trump is negotiating. There's a author and a thinker at the Jerusalem Post who believes that Trump is ultimately banging on the ground to scare out the snakes. In other words, trying to get relevant regional actors to assume their fair share of the burden in helping resolve this conflict.
Okay, so let's pick on that for a second. So you're saying that means the Egyptians and the Jordanians in receiving refugees and opening up borders and providing help. But when he says he's going to have Americans come and run Gaza, what does that really mean? Is that again a negotiating position? What does that mean?
It's very likely a negotiating point to force these countries to realize that, one, America is not going to rebuild the Gaza Strip unless it has some sort of influence. America has helped rebuild Gaza time and time again. It's given $7 billion to UNRWA since 1950. But even more so in recent conflicts, it's given hundreds of millions of dollars, approximately $400 million since 2023. How I interpret this ultimately is Trump is just ultimately trying to jolt regional actors to realize that they can't continue a perpetuating cycle in which foreign aid comes in to Hamas leadership, which aspires for genocide against Israel and the Jewish people, and to realize that the Gazan citizens in there also need a voluntary way out, and that Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, and even though Lebanon's not the focus of this, but all these countries for decades now have refused Palestinian refugees, and those whom have
Okay.
transcended into their borders.
All right, so let's take this a step further. All right, that's the immediate problem, but we've had this conversation before. The immediate problem comes from elsewhere, and I'm sure you'll tell me that if you want to look at troubles in Gaza, you have to look at Tehran. And then I can tell you, if you look at Tehran, you probably need to look at Beijing, because you have to follow the money trail where it's coming. So if that is the symptom of what is taking place and the real issues are coming from elsewhere, where does the Donald Trump administration fit in there?
Well, of course, the Trump administration has placed emphasis on restoring regional proxies of Iran and placing them back on the terrorist blacklist, such as the Houthis, who are now designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Trump, of course, has also sanctioned Iran. One big loophole that Trump hasn't quite addressed yet is Qatar, which has funded $2 billion to Hamas since 2012. It's one of the greatest sponsors of regional terrorism. It funded Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, whose Abu Muhammad al-Julani recently seized power. So Trump is making some good strides in combating terrorism financiers in the region. It really needs, however, to also address the Qatari threat, which the United States on both sides of the political aisle have coddled over the years and have ultimately increased and improved relations with, which I strongly disagree with.
Okay, so there's a complexity there. India-Qatari association was very unpleasant. Just a few months ago, 4 of our veterans had been put into Qatari jails, ironically of all things accused of spying for Israel. So let me get Ambassador Kapoor in. Ambassador Kapoor, in the Ukrainian question, to whatever settlement is coming our way, or to the question in Gaza, is it a consideration for us? Is it a talking point for us at all? Do we have any skin in the game, or or say on the table?
Well, I think we have a reasonably important role to play, because if we look at the Gaza situation, the IMEC corridor, if it gets active and active in the sense of it starts impacting the local economies of all the countries that it is passing through. The Israel-Palestine Gaza area would be one of those areas. So that could bring in a lot of jobs and employment and a lot of economic activity to that entire region. So from that perspective, the Indian role is there. India has been a very important partner of Israel. India has been a very important supporter of the Palestine cause earlier, before things went wrong in so many different ways. So in the Israel-Gaza conflict, India therefore has a very important role to play if it is asked to play that role. India is not a country which seeks out those roles, but when it is asked to come in and contribute its might, it does that very significantly. We have seen that in Cambodia. We have seen that in a lot of other countries.
Okay. Let's be reasonably realistic. All right. Now, if you want to be a great power, you're going to have to take on larger global responsibility. We are seeing India start down that road. 10 years ago, the biggest complaint was, and I've heard it, off the record many times, from people that it's okay to talk a big game, but in the end, where are you going to actually put boots on the ground? And the answer for us was always nowhere. We're not going to put boots on the ground in Gaza. We're not going to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan. We're not going to put boots on the ground in Syria, Lebanon, or the Ukraine, one side or the other side. So how do we navigate this? The reality is, this is not a conversation that is happening where India is being asked to sit on the table to figure it out. We are probably happy with that for now, but these issues are going to come for us, and our opinion is going to be sought, and our intervention is going to be sought. What's happening in the anti-piracy campaigns? I've never seen so many Indian ships so far from our shores doing, anti-piracy operations mean it's guns are blazing. Let's be practical.